He's been testing the link between nicotine and lung cancer for 30 years and hasn't found any conclusive results. The man's a genius. He can disprove gravity.
Faith in academic institutions, colleges, and universities is at an all-time low. Gallup polling from 2018 illustrated that 28% of Americans had a great deal of faith in higher education, 29% had quite a lot of faith, 33% had some faith, and only 9% had very little faith. As of July of 2023, 17% had a great deal of faith, 19% had quite a lot, 40% had some, and 22% had very little faith in higher education. That's a 255% increase in the number of people with little faith in academic institutions in under a decade. While this effect was most pronounced in self-identified Republicans, confidence has fallen across every single demographic. But is there a good reason for this fall in faith? Today, we're going to take a deep dive into a particularly egregious case of intellectual dishonesty, data manipulation, and of course, claims of racism, bigotry, and even academic lynching, leading down one of the deepest, most disturbing rabbit holes I've ever encountered in higher education. Today, we're going to be examining the case of Dr. Eric Stewart. But before we explore this galaxy of academic misconduct, let me tell you about how you can explore the galaxy from the comfort of your own home. And that's with this video's sponsor, Galaxy Lamps. Ever wanted your own personal planetarium? Well, Galaxy Lamps has you covered, using actual high-resolution NASA satellite imagery for every lamp in their collection. Their mobile app allows you to set timers, change color, speed, brightness, and themes to create and customize your own relaxing astronomical atmosphere in any room of your home. Galaxy projectors can be connected to Alexa or Google Assistant, so you can just say the word and escape into the vastness of stars and nebulae. Whether you're looking to enhance your gaming setup or your sleep, Galaxy projectors are an awesome, in the true sense of the word, way to make any space outer space. They also make fantastic gifts for any occasion. And Galaxy Lamps is offering a gift today to viewers of my channel. If you click the link in the description and pinned comment below, or go to galaxylamps.co/AidenPaladin and use the code AidenPaladin, one word, you'll get 15% off your own Galaxy projector. Thanks so much to Galaxy Lamps for sponsoring this video. And now that we can create our own universes from the comfort of our couches, let's explore the deep, dark black hole of academic error, retractions, and lost data that is the case of Dr. Eric Stewart. In July of 2023, a full professor of criminal justice was fired from his tenured position at Florida State University, where he had worked since 2004 and made $190,000 a year, following an extensive 4-year-long investigation into the veracity of his research and the retraction of 6 of his academic publications due to faulty, perhaps even fraudulent data. In May of 2018, an anonymous whistleblower going by the name John Smith contacted several of the co-authors who worked on 5 of those papers that would later be retracted, warning them of potential errors and even manipulation of data. Nick Brown and James Heathers, 2 scholars who have dedicated much of their time to uncovering academic misconduct, were also contacted by Smith and began an investigation into the claims. Similarly curious about said claims holding any water and likely concerned for the integrity of his own career, a former graduate student of Dr. Stewart's and professor of criminology at Albany State University, Dr. Justin Pickett, messaged Stewart expressing his worries, to which Stewart replied apologetically, and the two agreed that post-publication scrutiny was the new norm of academic life. As his concerns regarding the email and his own academic reputation mounted, Dr. Pickett also messaged Stewart with a request for data from a 2011 paper that they had co-authored on the subject of the role of ethnicity in judgments of punishments in criminal justice, so that he could analyze the data and corroborate the published findings. I ask you to keep this friendly interaction in mind, dear viewer, as the relationship between this former student and his teacher is going to take a dark turn. The paper in question, Ethnic Threat and Social Control, Examining Public Support for Judicial Use of Ethnicity in Punishment, had been published in Criminology, the premier journal of the entire field, and thus, if it truly was fraudulent or full of error, would not only represent a threat to the reputations of all of the authors, but to the very field of criminology itself. From Dr. Pickett's perspective, he had a good reason to be worried about the claims made by John Smith. While Dr. Stewart initially agreed to share the data, he then later told Dr. Pickett that he would be unable to satisfy his request due to data security issues at FSU. However, when Dr. Pickett contacted the university to confirm that data sharing was a breach of policy, a representative of the institution replied that there was no problem with data sharing so long as the original dataset remained unaltered. Stewart never provided the data to Pickett. Despite this roadblock, Dr. Pickett was undeterred in his desire to get to the bottom of the claims of the whistleblower. After all, again, remember that his name and reputation is also attached to this potentially fraudulent research, and thus he examined the limited data that he still had access to and found 500 duplicate responses, already representing a massive error in the dataset. Dr. Pickett then contacted one of the study's other authors, Dr. Gertz, who reached out to the survey company the team had used to collect their data, and subsequently provided him with the raw dataset. Dr. Pickett then compared them with the limited files that he still had access to, and found multiple significant differences between the raw data and the reported findings in the 2011 paper. Pickett also contacted the study's lead author, Dr. Brian Johnson, to inform him of the duplicated data, to which Johnson replied, "That's a huge mistake. Man, what a shit show. Obviously, we're going to have to retract the article or at a minimum update it with new data and findings." On July 6th of 2019, Dr. Pickett released his report to the world via the Open Science Framework. His key findings were as follows. 1. The article reports 1,184 respondents, but there were actually 500. 2. The article reports 91 counties, but actually there were 326. 3. The article describes respondents that differ substantially from those in the data. 4. The article reports 2 significant interaction effects, but actually there are none. 5. The article reports the effects of Hispanic growth is significant and positive, but actually it is non-significant and negative. 6. The article reports many other findings that do not exist in the data. 7. The standard errors are stable in our published article, but not in the actual data, or in articles published by other authors using similar modeling techniques with large samples. And 8. Although never mentioned in the article, 208 of the 500 respondents in the data, or 42%, have imputed values, that is, values assigned to them when no data was available. Basically, they didn't finish filling out the form, so somebody just went in and made it up.
My source is that I made it the f*** up.
Suddenly, the claims made by the anonymous whistleblower could no longer be so easily ignored by Florida State, and the university was then forced, due to the publicity towards the concerns raised both by John Smith and Dr. Pickett, as an article published in Retraction Watch brought greater coverage to the situation to the mainstream, to finally conduct a real investigation into Dr. Stewart's work, although they had been looking into it since late May when John Smith's initial emails were sent. While Dr. Pickett provided the administration with the data that he had been able to gather, Dr. Stewart never actually sent his raw data to the inquiry team, but instead his outputs from statistical software, as well as emails between himself and Jake Bratton of the Research Network regarding a 2008 survey, as well as what in the report are claimed to be datasets from a 2013 survey that was used in Dr. Stewart's other publications, supposedly also sent from the Research Network to Stewart in 2013, 2017, and 2018. Again, the report claims that Dr. Stewart sent this 2013 survey data to the school's inquiry committee, but here's the thing, that could not have happened because I don't think that dataset actually exists.
Objection! It's a fake!
Well, maybe a dataset exists, but it sure as hell could not have come from the Research Network, because the Research Network shuttered its doors in 2010. It and Jake Bratton could not have been involved in the gathering of data in 2013, 3 years after the organization shut down. The evidence for the existence of this dataset provided to the committee was merely an email between Stewart and Bratton, not the dataset itself, an email talking about it. And if emails are all that matter to an investigation, well, then there are some conversations to be had in Washington regarding a certain former presidential candidate. The email in question, sent from Stewart to Mark Gertz, the founder of the research network, in May of 2017, confirms only that some data were sent to Stewart in 2008, with no information about what that dataset actually was. The committee held several interviews with Stewart and determined that there was no evidence that the data had been fabricated, despite admitting in their own report that the studies were riddled with statistical and data errors. They also admit that there was a discrepancy between the number of counties included in the 2011 survey, being 91 in the publication, but with the raw data containing 292 counties from the 2008 Research Network dataset, and that Dr. Stewart's response to this discrepancy was that he clustered the counties in his reporting, although he said he could not explain why he chose to do so. The committee members suggested that perhaps Dr. Stewart was using a new statistical approach, which, Stewart himself did not suggest. Stewart also admitted to using data imputation, that is, making up for missing data.
Source?
It was revealed to me in a dream.
But regardless, the result of the inquiry was to clear Dr. Stewart of all claims of misconduct on July 29th of 2019. During the course of that investigation, on July 15th, Stewart sent an email to Diana Key, the Director of Research Compliance, and Gary Ostrander, the then Vice President for Research at FSU, to lodge a complaint against Justin Pickett and his allegations, noting that Pickett's paper had been downloaded more than 1,000 times and was being discussed on social media, with members of the public calling for Dr. Stewart's dismissal. He described the paper as, quote, an unwarranted and vicious attack on my character and intended to be malicious. Justin Pickett has essentially lynched me and my academic career, thereby severely impacting my career, credibility, and professional advancement.
I'm not questioning your honor.
Dr. Stewart.
I'm denying its existence.
I have no real idea what the purpose of this email was, other than to implicitly accuse Dr. Pickett of racism via the use of the very charged word lynching, and hoping for some kind of retaliation to be taken against him. Again, I don't know what Stewart believed that Ostrander and Key were going to be able to do to facilitate some kind of justice for this academic lynching, besides to lodge a complaint to the Criminology Department at Albany State. Internal emails at FSU throughout the year continually refer to John Smith and presumably now also Dr. Pickett as, quote, data thugs.
You try to stop thuggery, you power it up,
Yeah, don't.
And it moves beyond.
You have to ignore thuggery.
For example, in an email from August 30th of 2019 and post the publication of Dr. Pickett's piece from Professor Emeritus of Criminology at the University of Pennsylvania, say that one 5 times fast, Richard Burke, to the Dean of the Criminology Department at FSU, Thomas Blomberg, Dr. Burke speculated that the concerns regarding Dr. Stewart's research was politically motivated, encouraged Dr. Blomberg to paint the data thugs, again presumably now including Dr. Pickett, as science deniers, which tells us that that term was being used as a cudgel well before COVID, but ultimately to keep quiet about the allegations publicly and basically just hope that they would go away. Although Burke does also admit that a focus on quantity over quality has become an issue within the field, and that this scenario was thereby a form of comeuppance, it was comeuppance he seemingly thought should result in no change, besides to ignore it and call those exposing major flaws in research science deniers, of all things. The absolute audacity.
Sheer fucking hubris.
Finally, he suggested writing op-ed pieces to defend the behavior specifically in the New York Times and the Washington Post, which he implies that he and his colleagues at FSU have an ability to publish op-eds in, seemingly at will. Curious. Also in August, someone at Florida State made a police report about a possible threat made against them by Dr. Pickett. The report is believed to have been made in response to an email chain that Pickett was involved in with 2 of Stewart's other co-authors, Drs. Eric Balmer and Patricia Warren Hightower, both of whom encouraged Pickett to simply give Stewart more time to locate his own data, and responded to the concerns, ensuring him that there was nothing to be worried about, to which Pickett replied that, quote, "Let me stop this before it turns into an assault," end quote, which Pickett later clarified he meant as an assault on his reputation, the reputation of his colleagues, and the field in general. It's certainly not call the police threatening, but yeah, a little bit aggressive.
You stop me again whilst I'm walking, and I'll cut your Jacobs off.
Dr. Pickett concluded the exchange with the two by telling them that, "You can do whatever you want with this information. I don't care." While yes, Dr. Pickett may have worded his email poorly, I don't think that it warranted a phone call to the police. Despite Stewart being cleared of misconduct and continuing his work at FSU and his colleagues seeming ambivalence at best and ire towards the messenger at worst,
Why you boring me? I'm right.
Dr. Pickett was not deterred from his goal of ensuring that the truth come to light. And on November 10th of 2019, he announced on Twitter that he and his fellow co-authors, including Stewart, were officially requesting the retraction of the 2011 paper. In an interview with the Chronicle of Higher Education, the editor-in-chief of Criminology, the journal in which the paper was published, David McDowell said, quote, "I don't even quite know what a retraction is," and instead cast aspersions on Pickett and his intentions, saying that Pickett often said cruel things about Stewart, although he couldn't recall any specifics.
That's not a journal, that's not a study, that's not an organization, that's not an institution, you're just saying words.
McDowell's conclusion regarding Pickett was that he was simply vindictive, stating, quote, "I think criminology is maybe a little behind other disciplines because we haven't adopted the blood sport of ruining other people's careers," end quote. People like the editor-in-chief of the premier criminology journal not knowing what retraction is and referring to it as a blood sport are the reasons why the legal system is so bad that Chris Chan is a free man. Woman. Whatever. Regardless, it seems that McDowell did eventually figure out what a retraction is because the paper was subsequently retracted in December of 2019 and stricken from the academic record. Only the first, and certainly not the last. But with that 2011 study now pulled, let's look at the next component of this house of cards to come crashing down. Stewart's multiple papers using phone survey data regarding racial discrimination in criminal justice and the importance of historical lynchings, of which he would claim he was the current victim of, how these studies were funded, and how they were all retracted. Four papers, one published in 2015, two in 2018, and one in 2019, in which Stewart was an author, relied on data collected from national random telephone surveys, the source of which was not specified in any of the papers, but perhaps are implied to have been collected by the National Research Network, as Stewart had previously used the network in 2008. In March of 2018, and before this entire debacle began, Dr. Pickett approached Mark Gertz, the founder and president of the then long-since defunct Research Network, with questions regarding a 2013 dataset used by Dr. Stewart in at least 3, perhaps 4, I don't know for sure, and the fact that I don't should be telling, of his papers and about potentially working together on survey research in the future. This was a friendly email exchange, as Dr. Pickett was not investigating any misconduct at this point. Gates denied that the 2013 research was conducted by them, and asked if Dr. Pickett was doing well. The politeness, again, will not last. In February of 2019, Nick Brown and James Heathers, who had been contacted by John Smith, took particular interest in the most recent publication involving this dataset, published just weeks earlier on July 25th of 2019, titled A Legacy of Lynchings, Perceived Black Criminal Threat Among Whites, on which Stewart was the second author. The authors claim that their data illustrate that white people who live in communities where historical lynchings had occurred perceive black people as being a greater criminal threat than those who live in counties without a history of lynchings. Brown and Heathers immediately noticed some oddities in the paper's methodology. First, the sample consisted of 2,763 respondents, contacted by phone, which is a pretty hefty sample size for any type of survey, but particularly so for a phone survey, which takes far more time and people, and therefore money, to conduct. The Rand Corporation prices their services for phone surveying at $3.25 per minute for the first 500 respondents, $2.75 for the next 500, and $2 per minute for more than 1,000 respondents, meaning 1,000 subjects completing a 10-minute phone survey would cost about $32,000. The cost from Rand then for 2,763 respondents, presuming a 10-minute survey, would be over $67,000. A 2017 article from Versta Research, which also conducts such phone-based surveying, states that a survey of 1,000 adults by phone would start at $45,000 at a bare minimum. The cost of a decent-sized car or 3 aspirin in the medical system that you have to chew out of the bark yourself. Phone surveying is time-consuming and laborious, as generally speaking, people don't like to be bothered with questions from a random caller, let alone questions about race relations.
Jews for Jesus. Oh! Read about Jehovah's Witness. How about Buddhism?
It takes huge teams of trained callers, dozens if not hundreds of hours, dialing number after number, which itself is increasingly difficult as fewer and fewer Americans even have active landlines or have unlisted phone numbers. For these reasons, phone surveys also typically have very low response rates. Pew surveying revealed that between 2017 and 2018, phone response rates had fallen to between 7 and 8%. Although if we were to assume that these data are from 2013, then response rates may have been as high as 9%. Staggering. All of these issues are why phone surveys are so incredibly expensive to conduct and thus typically are not something an independent scholar can afford, even on a nearly $200,000 a year salary, such as that of Dr. Stewart, and usually therefore require a grant to fund. Scholars are required to disclose any source that has funded their research, and yet no such grant or organization is included in these papers. This is not a suggestion. It is necessary for academic transparency to know if someone or something is funding the research. Looking at Dr. Stewart's CV does reveal that he has received several significant research grants that could have funded this endeavor, but the last one that he reported receiving ended in 2012, and thus could not be the source of the funding for the 2013 data. Moreover, Dr. Stewart's papers using the telephone surveys reported an astonishing 61% response rate. Not 7%, nor 8%, nor 9%, but 61%. Yeah, there's a reason why this looked fishy to Brown and Heathers at its face. You couldn't get that kind of response rate if you had people at gunpoint, particularly as it relates to a study about such a sensitive topic. It's a bit difficult to believe that 61% of people picked up the phone from an unknown number, were asked to respond to a survey for which they would receive no compensation regarding race relations, and the results were that, well, they spent the next 10 minutes incriminating themselves.
And you've called the police to ask how illegal meth is?
Well, yeah, I figured if anyone would know, it'd be you guys.
Is this Darnell Bickham's of Cherrywood Road?
No, Darnell's not here right now. Can I take a message?
You'd think the majority of people would just say shoot me rather than be involved in this. The other seriously suspicious thing about the methods was that Stewart not only doesn't disclose any funding, but he and his colleagues also don't disclose how the survey was conducted or who conducted it. The best guess that Heathers, Brown, Pickett, and others had was the now defunct Research Network, given that Stewart had worked with them to collect survey data in the past, but again, no source for the phone surveys is given in the 4 studies that claim to use phone survey data, leaving the Research Network as merely the main suspect. On the 6th of August 2019, Gertz, the founder and president of the former Research Network, sent out an email stating that he had sent datasets to Stewart in 2008, 2009, 2013, 2017, and 2018 at a minimum, and that any claims of Stewart having access to only one dataset were incorrect. The problem with Mark's response, though, is that it doesn't answer the serious questions about what these datasets were. Was the one that he sent Stewart in 2013 the sample of nearly 3,000 participants collected via phone survey? Surely you would think that Gertz would remember if Stewart, and it would have had to have been Stewart himself as he gave no grant or funding disclosures on the projects using those phone data, had paid his company something like $70,000 to collect them, at a minimum, because it looks like there's at least 2 surveys here. On October 31st of 2019, Gertz clarified in another email to Pickett that these datasets he sent to Stewart were not different surveys, but access to different surveys, which isn't exactly clear, but sounds like what he sent Stewart was existing datasets rather than having collected data for Stewart's personal projects. A similar sentiment was expressed in an email from one of Stewart's co-authors, Dr. Daniel Mears, that Gertz had provided Stewart with the data from other projects conducted by the Research Network. He was adamant in his email that the data absolutely do exist. Curiously though, neither Gertz nor Mears either specify at any point that the data they shared or worked on with Dr. Stewart involved massive phone surveying, let alone 2, which again is implied by the existence of the 2015 paper. Everyone seems to be dancing around what datasets are being referenced, and yet no one seems to be able to actually produce the datasets, nor explain how they were collected and who paid for it.
How'd it get burned? How'd it get burned? How'd it get burned? I don't know!
Similarly, almost all of FSU's investigations into Dr. Stewart's work focused on that 2011 paper that he co-authored with Dr. Pickett, as well as a 2003 paper, not one of the papers that used this mysterious phone survey data that everyone is avoiding talking about directly. Only one of the university's inquiries, conducted in 2021, which we'll look more at later, examined standard deviation mean discrepancies across 10 of his publications, although the report does not even specify which 10 papers were examined, so I can't even say for sure that that specific inquiry examined the 2015 to 2018 and 2019 papers that supposedly used phone survey data from a 2013 dataset whose origins are a complete mystery, given that they could not have been conducted by the research network because the research network did not exist at that point in time. The best case scenario I can imagine here is that the committee didn't even bother to look at the data, because the data don't seem to exist. But in the worst case, they actively covered this up. This man, claiming to be lynched, Dr. Stewart, appeared to, at least potentially, have a conspiracy working in his favor at FSU. So what exactly are these studies? The first is The Social Context of Latino Threat and Punitive Latino Sentiment, which surveyed 1,379 US adults via phone in 2008, meaning this one at least theoretically could have been conducted by the research network, but we're still talking about a survey that would have cost about $50,000 at a minimum, and the research network is not named, nor are any funding sources disclosed. This survey also received a ludicrous response rate of 54.8%, again about 5 times higher than is typical for such a project. The final sample of 1,186 white non-Latino respondents were asked to what extent they agreed or disagreed with statements such as, quote, "The U.S. criminal justice system is too lenient with Hispanic offenders," end quote, and were asked a series of questions concerning the perceived threat that Latinos represent, criminally, politically, and economically, to the white participants. Stewart and his colleagues' results were illustrative that Latino population growth and perceived Latino criminal and economic threat significantly predicted punitive criminal justice Latino sentiments amongst their white participants. This effect was more pronounced in regions that had recently experienced a growth in the Latino population. The takeaway? Well, white people are bigots, of course. And when white people perceived that new immigrant population as a threat to their communities, economically or criminally, they were more likely to be in favor of harsher punitive measures taken against Latinos. It doesn't really matter though, because this paper was placed under review by the Journal of Social Problems, which I swear is a real thing and not a Monty Python skit.
Last year, the government spent less on the Ministry of Civil Defense than it did on national defense.
And was subsequently retracted. This was one paper where it appears that the journal staff became aware after a tip from a reader of the scandals surrounding Dr. Stewart and conducted their own review, whereas most of the others were specifically requested for retraction by the authors. This study is also a bit anomalous compared to the other 3 because, again, it could have been conducted by the research network in theory. Again, it's difficult to believe that 55% of people called at random would have responded by saying clearly racially insensitive things on a phone survey, which reduces the inherent anonymity and increases potentiality for social desirability effects in surveying. That is, people don't want to be seen as racist or bigoted or otherwise bad people, even when anonymized, but particularly so when only pseudo-anonymized via phone call. Recall that these data were collected the year that Barack Obama was first elected president. The contention is that these people picked up the phone to be actively racist for 10 minutes, and I just find that a little bit difficult to buy. These are regular people on the phone, not my ghostwriter's Twitter. Dr. Stewart published 2 studies in 2018, the first of which was The Social Context of Criminal Threat, Victim Race, and Punitive Black and Latino Sentiment, which queried 2,736 American adults via phone survey with a 60.8% response rate, and was conducted, allegedly, in 2013 with a different sample size and response rates compared to the previous study, meaning that this could not have been just one study costing a minimum of about $70,000, but 2 studies, both of which have no paper trail, no funding source, nothing. In this instance, the authors were only interested in the 2,408 subjects who identified as non-Latino white. Participants were questioned regarding their general punitive sentiments towards both Black and Latino people, and were given a series of scenarios describing different victim-offender dyads, and were asked to rate the seriousness of these scenarios. Questions included, for example, quote, "In the US, are criminal acts more serious when a Black offender commits a violent crime against a white victim? Or, in the US, are criminal acts more serious when a Hispanic offender commits a violent crime against a Black victim?" Such that each combination of victim and offender race was assessed. General perceived public threat of Latinos and Blacks and the percentage of the participants' area that was Black or Latino, including growth of those populations over time, were all measured. The results indicated that both perceptions of criminal threat and minority population growth were significantly related to punitive sentiments, and said sentiment was more significant when judging scenarios wherein minorities were the offenders and whites the victims. Reported racial threat strongly influenced the effect of victim race on punitiveness. All again, at least according to Dr. Stewart, because the editors of Social Problems placed an errata warning on the digital version of the paper in May of 2019, following a report from a reader regarding the paper's accuracy, and at some point afterwards it was retracted. You know it's bad when your paper about race relations starts getting patch notes.
When the Pope releases a patch on Catholicism that results in every fucking purgatory baby from the beginning of time until now ceasing to exist.
What are you telling me the patch wrecked my save file?
The other 2018 study, titled Lynchings, Racial Threat, and Whites' Punitive Views Towards Blacks, is similar in vein as the former, but this time utilized the same sample of 2,736, of which 1,441 lived in southern states, where such acts had historically been committed. This time the authors specified that the phone survey was conducted in 2013, as with the previous study, had an incomprehensible response rate of 61%, which the authors describe as comparable to other studies with rigorous survey methods, laughable and factually incorrect. Participants were asked questions such as, quote, "The U.S. criminal justice system needs tougher prison sentences on Black offenders," end quote, as well as questions concerning the perceived criminal threat posed by Black people and perceptions of the prevalence of Black-on-white crime. They found that participants who lived in areas where lynchings had historically occurred expressed more punitive sentiments towards Black offenders compared to those who lived in areas where they had not, and that this sentiment was partially mediated by perceptions of Blacks as criminals and as threats to whites. Additionally, the effective location on punitiveness was more pronounced in the white respondents who viewed Blacks as a threat to whites. Again, seemingly solid evidence that Southern whites are racists. Too bad no one has any idea where these data came from and, oh, yeah, it was also retracted. The irony of a Black academic conducting a study to prove that all white people think that Blacks are criminals while seemingly committing academic fraud is absolutely palpable. Like, come on, man, what are you doing? In August of 2019, the authors, of which Stewart is first, responded with a corrigendum that is a correction, after the editors became concerned due to the allegations mounting against Stewart. But after communicating, presumably with Stewart, the editors determined that the number of coding mistakes and transcription errors were too extensive for any correction to be sufficient, and as such, it was officially stricken from the academic record on December 6th of 2019. December of 2019 is a bit of an important month for this story as it pertains to Dr. Stewart's data, as in an April 11th, 2022 investigatory interview conducted by the Florida State faculty with Dr. Stewart, he claimed it was sometime in December of that year that his hard drive crashed, causing him to lose all of his raw data from the apparently two separate massive phone surveys that collectively should have cost him personally something in the vicinity of $100,000 to $200,000 to collect. Look, I'm a bit of a ditz when it comes to saving my work. I can't actually even recall the number of times now that I've lost hours and hours of work because Microsoft Word crashed for no apparent reason, and the autosave function had decided to turn itself off, as it is often wont to do. But I think that if I had access to data that had cost me $100,000 minimum, even my ditzy ass would back that shit up. Maybe Dr. Stewart could pursue a future career in NFTs, given his track record. The final paper utilizing the mysterious phone survey data, and with nearly identical purpose as the aforementioned 2018 study, titled A Legacy of Lynchings, Perceived Black Criminal Threat Among Whites, the little-known sequel to The Legacy of Cain, legacy of Kane and Lynch, not a crossover that we needed, and a way to make your race agitation article sound like a Kingdom Hearts spin-off, but first authored by Dr. Mears and second authored by Dr. Stewart, was published in January of 2019 and was the paper that piqued the interest of Heathers and Brown. This study was again nearly identical in purpose to the other 2018 lynching study, and supposedly came from the same phone dataset. So, the callers queried 2,408 white respondents out of a total sample of 2,736 regarding their perceived threat of black criminality and the perceived prevalence of black-on-white crime. These respondents were geocoded to determine which responses came from participants residing in regions where lynchings had historically occurred. The prevalence of poverty and portion of the population who were unemployed, as well as the portion that voted Republican, were also assessed. Whites believed that blacks represented a greater criminal threat when they were male, conservative, and more fearful of black people in general. Perceived criminal threat was also higher in areas where historical lynchings had occurred, as well as in areas with a significant level of growth amongst the black population. This effect was most pronounced in more impoverished areas. Except, again, no, it wasn't, because we have absolutely no way of knowing if any of these data are real, and if they were assessed correctly, given Dr. Stewart's consistent issues with accurate data analysis, which we will see plenty more of going forward. Given that this paper was published in the midst of a growing public concern regarding the veracity of Dr. Stewart's work, it immediately came under fire. An update was quickly provided by the authors to correct what they described as a coding error. Again, there's that precision at work as usual. And were also aided by Stuart Tolnay, E.M. Beck, and Amy Bailey, who all provided accurate data regarding lynchings to supplement the problems with the paper. Despite what appears to be a group effort to salvage it, the number of coding mistakes and transcription errors far exceeded the acceptable state of a published academic piece of work. As for every patch they provided, another hole in the data revealed itself. As such, on December 11th of 2019, Dr. Stewart himself contacted the editors of Law and Society Review to request the paper's retraction. The following day, on December 12th, the 2011 paper that Stewart had co-authored with Dr. Pickett was also retracted from the Journal of Criminology. Over the course of a year, Dr. Stewart was forced to retract 4 of his most recently published academic papers, a 2011 publication, and was headed toward the holidays with his 2003 paper still under intense review, only to later be retracted in 2021. As mentioned, it was also in that December that Dr. Stewart reported to FSU that his hard drive had suddenly been destroyed, causing him to lose all access to these valuable data, and thus making it impossible for anyone to look deeper into the 4 papers that used that expensive phone surveying of mysterious funding and origin. Beginning in January of 2023, Dr. Lisa Saknovich, an investigator for the National Science Foundation, began searching for this elusive dataset, and thus subpoenaed Florida State for access. While she was able to locate the files related to the 2011 paper on which Pickett was co-author, she was not able to locate files with the data from the 1,372 phone survey respondents collected, potentially, by the research network. And if you've noticed that the number of participants involved keeps changing, yeah, that's one thing that's consistent about this case: inconsistency. Either way, though, it seems that this request was for the data used in the 2015 paper, which seems to be a different data set from the phone surveys used in the 2 2018 and 2019 papers, which Stewart claims was conducted in 2013. Saknovich didn't even seem to be looking for that data set, collected by someone, somewhere, after the research network was shuttered, but rather only this 2008 data set that at least potentially could have been conducted by them. FSU's attorney, Gavin Burgess, responded to Saknovich's request for the research network data by stating that he was unable to locate the files and sought out Dr. Stewart in hopes that he would still have them. Of course, and astonishingly, he did not, but Stewart insisted to Burgess that he had handed the data over to FSU previously. So, where are the files? I'm not sure if these events are related or not, but in February of 2023, in the middle of Dr. Saknovich's fruitless investigation, Dr. Stewart was actually invited to serve as a reviewer on the National Science Foundation's Law and Science Program Spring 2023 panel, giving him an opportunity to potentially help determine which proposals for scientific research should receive grants from the NSF. Well, we all know what kind of studies that the NSF likes to fund.
NSF, ensuring U.S. global leadership through investments that expand the frontiers of knowledge and technology and support an increase in the STEM workforce in critical fields such as artificial intelligence, supercomputers, and the environment. The National Science Foundation, where discoveries begin.
After 6 retractions, 4 investigations, Dr. Stewart was actively sought out by the NSF to determine which scholars' projects should receive funding, in a move that even the UN, which has had in the past both Saudi Arabia and China as members of its Human Rights Council, would describe as taking the piss.
The NSF are terrorists. They want people dead. Dead. Word. I don't understand.
As of the time of this writing, no one has ever been able to find those 2 phone survey datasets that Dr. Stewart claimed to have used, one conducted in 2008 and thereby at least possibly the work of the Research Network, and the other conducted in 2013, which has absolutely no source. But now, with 5 papers having been retracted, surely Florida State must finally have been interested in looking deeper into what the hell was going on in their criminology department, right? Well, let's look at how the university responded. Outside of the several inquiries, most of which did not even bother to actually investigate any of the claims made against Dr. Stewart's work, Florida State repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to not just ignore claims of misconduct, but to outright protect Stewart at seemingly any cost, even its own academic reputation. An article published in the Chronicle of Higher Education by Tom Barlett on September 24th of 2019 covered not only the concerns of Heathers and Brown regarding the source of Stewart's mysterious phone survey data, but also those of Pickett and his ongoing troubles trying to get the university to take his concerns and those of John Smith seriously, revealing many details regarding Pickett's interactions with other scholars at FSU, including McDowell, Baumer, and Warren Hightower. The publication of this article only brought further public attention to the entire affair, and later, on January 12th of 2020, Dean Blomberg sent an email to FSU's VP of Research, Gary Ostrander, discussing Stewart's retention of attorneys from a law firm previously used by FSU to send cease and desist letters to both Pickett and to the Chronicle, in hopes that the outlet would retract their article and even offer a public apology. As of October of 2023, over 3 years later, the article is still up and contains no apology. Dean Blomberg's email also references a video that he says greatly disturbed him, which is this one, published by Coffee Break on December 27th of 2019, titled "The Perfect Crime: Scientific Fraud in America." The video covers much of the same timeline of events that we have in this video, based on what information was available at the time, and includes a brief interview with Dr. Pickett. I reached out to Dr. Pickett with request for further interview, but after 5 years of dealing with this, he understandably wants nothing more to do with it. So please don't go and bother the man. Going back to his interview with Coffee Break, the Wayback Machine illustrates that by January 9th of 2020, the video had received over 160,000 views. It currently sits at over 400,000 as of September of 2023. Dean Blomberg said the video disturbed him greatly, but I must wonder why. Was it because the video was inaccurate? Or was it because the story was getting too big to cover up, hence the hiring of the legal team? I assume the Pinkertons were otherwise occupied, attempting to make the tabletop gaming scene look like the Congolese rubber trade. Given that 3 papers were retracted in December of 2019 alone, the university could no longer write off the problems with Dr. Stewart's research, and thus, following a January 14th email from Dr. Pickett which raised questions again about that 2003 publication, FSU initiated an inquiry into that specific paper. In School Social Bonds, School Climate, and School Misbehavior, a multi-level analysis, Stewart argued that social bonds with other students as well as the school's climate, which includes a sense of attachment, feeling that teachers are invested in student success, school involvement, including participation in extracurricular activities, school commitment, including interest and satisfaction with schoolwork, and belief in following school rules, were key predictors of juvenile misbehavior, leading to suspension or expulsion, in urban schools specifically. In contrast, his study reported that the percentage of non-white students, poverty, and student social problems were unrelated to misbehavior, contradicting prior research. Dr. Pickett's January 2020 email to the FSU administration relating to the aforementioned 2003 paper included data from a recreation that he had conducted in an attempt to test the reliability and validity of the publication using the same raw data set from the National Education Longitudinal Study that Stewart had also used. Pickett's concerns included impossible clustering of students, impossible numbers of schools, impossible sample characteristics, impossible factor loadings, and other irregularities. So just to reiterate, almost every facet of this 2003 paper just could not exist. For example, Stewart claimed to have 6,241 students in urban schools in his sample, but the raw data illustrate that there were only 5,710 such students. Using his own reported methods of deleting students with missing data would result in more than 1,000 fewer participants than those that Stewart reported. More than 700 fewer schools than were reported in Stewart's data compared to the raw. That the question concerning misbehavior was not asked in the first wave of national data collection in 1988 and thereby could not be compared to data collected in 1990, when the misbehavior question was included. That Dr. Stewart claimed 67.1% of students had never been suspended, when the raw data illustrate that the true number was between 88% and 90%, depending on which sample was being utilized. And those are all just a few examples of the errors present in Stewart's 2003 report. Not only does he seem to be a fraud, he also appears to be kind of terrible at it.
Excuse me.
Oh no, I think being illegal makes it more exciting.
In response, FSU again called Stewart in for an interview regarding the allegations, to which Stewart admitted that he no longer had access to any of the files associated with that research, which honestly is understandable given the age of the study and that Dr. Stewart had conducted it while working on his own doctoral degree. Additionally, Stewart's paper omits a large amount of information, meaning the committee had very little actual data to go off of that could possibly contradict the claims of Pickett and locate the source of the discrepancies, given that this analysis was based on publicly available data. Dr. Stewart attempted his own recreation and was able to largely replicate his results, but in order to obtain numbers similar to those published in 2003, Stewart dropped all respondents lacking a student ID and from schools that reported with fewer than 17 eligible respondents. That is, students with a history of misbehavior in schools in which they were the vast minority. In doing the former, more schools became ineligible for inclusion, which left Stewart with a sample of 12,250 in 2019, compared to a sample of 10,578 in 2003, which, while similar, is still far from identical. The committee found that in the process of deleting some student data, Stewart made significant coding errors that subsequently inflated the factor loadings, similar to what seemingly occurred in 2003, and the exact concern of Dr. Pickett. That is, Dr. Stewart was accused of miscalculating his results in his 2003 paper, and to prove that he had not, he produced results that were also miscalculated in the exact same way. You just can't make this up. Astonishingly, however, the university chalked this all up to a mistake, and not more evidence of academic misconduct nor fraud. Yep, that's right. Dr. Stewart couldn't provide his original data analysis, which Dr. Pickett illustrated via his own was faulty, and then, 20 years later, having worked as a professor that entire time, made the exact same mistakes that he made as a grad student. And the university's response was,
"This is fine. I'm okay with the events that are unfolding currently."
Florida State then refused to investigate any further. Despite FSU's unwillingness to accept the reality that Dr. Stewart had published bad data, writing it off as happy little accidents, even after the retraction of the 2011 paper, said unwillingness to correct the record was not present everywhere in academia. As on June 8th of 2020, Justice Quarterly, the journal in which the 2003 paper was published, retracted it due to the extensive errors, the inability of other scholars to replicate the findings, as well as Stewart's own inability to properly replicate his own findings without including similar errors. Thus, another paper was struck from the record, all while FSU remained adamant that Stewart had done no wrong, despite refusing to conduct their own thorough investigation, and really conduct one. Given that Dr. Stewart was not a professor at FSU when the 2003 paper was conducted, another university, Georgia State, where Stewart worked at the time of his first professorship position, also conducted an inquiry into the paper in 2020 after being emailed in January by Dr. Pickett. Unlike FSU, Georgia State's committee bothered to actually attempt to replicate the findings of both Stewart and Pickett to determine if Pickett's claims held water. The inquiries committee states that they were able to replicate similar numbers of students per school, schools, and total number of students, although their results were not identical, and they attributed this to analytic method or unintentional error. The committee could not, however, even slightly replicate the number of urban schools reported in Dr. Stewart's report, which claimed that 21% of the schools assessed were in urban areas, while Georgia State found that 43% of them were urban, more than twice as many schools. The committee was also unable to find a simple answer to the impossible factor loadings, as laid out in Dr. Pickett's complaints. Georgia found that 88.7% of students had never been suspended, while Dr. Stewart reported that 87.95% had never been suspended. A small difference, but one which the committee could not reproduce. Despite these issues, the group decided that they could not determine with certainty that the errors in the data were the result of malice or misconduct rather than accident. Regardless of these two institutions determining that while there were definite issues with Dr. Stewart's 2003 publication, ultimately, the Justice Quarterly Journal in which it was published had the final say in whether or not it should be retracted, and on January 21st of 2021, the journal decided against Dr. Stewart's favor, retracting the article due to the number of errors, the inability of others to replicate the results, and the lack of original data against which to judge the analysis. And thus, a sixth publication was struck from the record. Unlike the others, this one was a solo publication of Dr. Stewart's, and while the retraction of the others could impact the reputations of those other scholars, this retraction affected Dr. Stewart, and only Dr. Stewart. On April 1st, an auspicious date, Stewart sent an email to Gary Ostrander and Dean Blomberg, replying to a request for a chronology of events regarding his research, but also took the opportunity to state that he had been consistently cleared of any wrongdoing and to instead blame the criticisms of his work as a racist attack on his career and character, stating, quote,
"It speaks volumes that I, a black full professor, was targeted by white complainants whose allegations against me were meant to discredit my research and reputation. The complainants formed a narrative built on incomplete and inaccurate information and wasted no time sharing this false narrative via numerous public platforms. Such actions lack integrity and run counter to the confidential inquiry process. This matter was not handled privately or with professional respect, as has been the case with other scholars. Contrary to my treatment, other scholars with substantial errors in their scholarship were permitted to rerun analyses and offer clarification on the concerns raised about their scholarship without accusations of research misconduct."
Of course, Dr. Stewart did run replications of his 2003 paper, but was unable to reproduce his results. And of course, this was sent by email because no one at this point could be so brazen and bold in their misconstruals to say any of that with a straight face in person. But Dr. Stewart continues.
"Further, I am deeply concerned about the use of anonymous reviewers as I do not know their qualifications. It is critical that the reviewers have experience merging multiple large data files, as well as knowledge of the varied analytical techniques utilized in the articles. In addition to requesting reviewers with such credentials, I would like to request a racially diverse panel of reviewers. Specifically, if the total number of anonymous reviewers is 4, I would like to request that half be black scholars. Given the racialized injustice that I have endured, I believe that a racially diverse panel of reviewers will bring their experiences and expertise to this process and provide a fair assessment."
I find it curious that Dr. Stewart's excuse for the failures of his own work, some of which he himself had personally requested retraction of due to blatant, irreconcilable errors, is that all of the complaints against said work is the product of racism, and rather than take accountability, he instead points to other scholars with sketchy work that had not faced similar scrutiny. I don't know, Dr. Stewart, maybe the problem is that in your case, the issue wasn't a minor error here or there, but persistent, major, fundamental errors across your work, ranging from basic mean standard deviation discrepancies to impossible characteristics and factor loadings, to having somehow funded studies that would have cost tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars with no funding source, to the fact that all of your data were mysteriously corrupted the second that it went under a microscope. Maybe that's why your work was being criticized in the way that others was not. You were either lying or you were incompetent beyond comprehension. Either way, the IRS, which wants information on every $500 Venmo transaction, should investigate those expensive phone surveys.
I'm crazy enough to take on Batman, but the IRS? No, thank you.
Additionally, his fear of anonymous reviewers, which is a requirement for blind peer review, is concerning, and his insistence on half of the panel being black is illustrative of his own racial biases as he applies it to research. His request flies in the face of the purpose of the entire peer review process, and instead seems to reflect a request to get his friends on the review board to give him a pass, given his notoriety within the field. Could you even imagine a white professor requesting that half of the reviewers of his work be white? Gary Ostrander even responded to Stewart via email, reminding him of what any grad student, let alone full professor, already knows, that the use of anonymous reviewers is standard practice. I'm not actually sure who provided these examples in the massive Research Watch document that catalogs the emails, inquiries, and reports, social media activity, and other information that I've used as sources in this video, which will of course be linked below in a searchable format, as the original PDF was very difficult to read. But regardless, included in the documents are examples of error in other papers published by FSU faculty and from across the field of criminology, including one paper co-authored by Dr. Mears, someone who had stood up for Dr. Stewart, I might add, in which 80% of the values in one table were incorrect. But whether or not it was Dr. Stewart who provided these examples that ended up in this monster document, the fact that there are errors in other academic papers does not absolve you, Dr. Stewart. If Stewart was the one who provided these examples, particularly the one calling out Dr. Mears, who had consistently been in his corner, well, that's some truly revolting treachery. Bad data should be called out, all of it. But the fact that it's specifically his co-author and a man who has defended him, who he is calling out, seemingly, is particularly egregious. I could be wrong about who provided these examples, however. As I said, there's no specific source given. The point is that the solution to bad research should not be to just ignore it, but to do better. All of it should be called out, all of it should be investigated. It seems to me that Dr. Stewart's mentality is such that because other people make mistakes, he should be held to no standards. That's not how this is supposed to work. This isn't the gaming industry. Who do you think you are, Ubisoft?
You have been banned from the Assassin's Creed forums. Reason.
These aren't poetry journals that you're publishing in. You're producing research that can and does influence jurisprudence, public policy, and politics. So yes, what you publish actually does matter, and it matters that it's correct. In my opinion, some of Dr. Stewart's work appears to be wholly and entirely fabricated, namely those 4 telephone surveys, given their cost, the lack of funding, and the data's bizarre disappearance. But most commonly, it seems that his problems were simply being sloppy, and I will explain more about that in just a moment when we get into the maths and statistics a bit, and trust me, I'll try to keep that part relatively short. But when you have persistent errors, with something as simple as a discrepancy between the mean and standard deviation, then the answer must be incompetence or malice. Nothing else can explain how you can screw up a mathematical constant. And speaking of, let's talk about those errors and Florida State's 3rd inquiry into Dr. Stewart. FSU conducted another inquiry into Dr. Stewart's work in October of 2021, which specifically examined discrepancies between the standard deviations and the means across 10 of his published studies. There is a mathematical relationship between standard deviations and means, which means that as the mean changes, the standard deviation changes. The committee noted many anomalous SDs, to the point that they admitted it constituted a problem, and specifically a pattern of a problem, that could not be attributed to rounding, transcription, or copying errors. They suggested that this may be the result of missing values and the use of more advanced statistical analysis that resulted in improperly small SD sizes, and concluded that there was no reason to believe that the errors they observed were due to misconduct rather than error. They still, in fact, found significant error regarding standard deviation and mean discrepancies. But they concluded, however, that the errors didn't really matter, as they do not substantially change the overall findings of the paper. Well, I would contend that if you can't do basic maths, that maybe all of the findings should be under scrutiny. But just because FSU refused to do it doesn't mean everyone else was so incompetent nor negligent. Thus, let's take a look at a couple of the mathematical errors that were pointed out to FSU and to Dr. Stewart's co-authors all the way back in 2018. While I know it might be a bit dense and probably boring, I feel it necessary to talk about the specific mathematical errors in Dr. Stewart's work, and in doing so I also want to take a quick aside to look at John Smith's initial email and some of the issues raised before Dr. Pickett conducted his own reviews. Because despite Smith being waved away as a politically motivated data thug, the email is unemotional, clinical, and academic. So, what did John Smith send to Drs. Mears, Johnson, Stewart, Pickett, and others that went ignored for so long? Well, first, John Smith requested access to the raw data for analysis, but of course, he, as with everyone else, never received it. He begins by pointing out that the paper first authored by Mears had changed all of its tables between the time that it was published online and printed physically in the Journal of Law and Society Review due to supposed coding errors, something we briefly covered, by removing all of the reports of standard deviations, which is certainly one way to fix a discrepancy between your means and standard deviations. Just don't report the standard deviations. But what the heck does any of that actually mean? What does the mean mean? Well, the mean is the average drawn from a data set. Add up all of the values in the data set and divide by the total number of values, and you have your mean, the center, the average. The standard deviation is the variation from the mean, how much the data are spread out from the center. In this way, the mean and standard deviation are inexorably linked, but they weren't in that 2019 paper. And rather than attempting to resolve the discrepancy, these standard deviations were simply erased from the physical publication. Stewart actually responded to a direct email from John Smith regarding the issue in a brief back and forth in May of 2018, acknowledging that it was an issue. That's because Mears et al. 2019 was not the only paper with this problem. Every single paper of the 5 that Smith examined, and those were not the only ones as the committee later examined 10, displayed mean standard deviation discrepancies. It is simply impossible to calculate the standard deviations reported in these studies given the reported means and sample sizes in the respective papers. Whether this consistent misreporting of standard deviations was due to error or fraud is not something that I can determine, nor really anyone can determine, from these discrepancies alone. However, the problem is consistent and something, again, mathematically impossible. John Smith also noted a rather unusual uniformity in the standard errors across several of the studies. Standard error is the calculation of standard deviation of the mean of means across a number of samples. And yeah, I know that sounds a bit wonky, and yeah, I know this video is an investigation into serious allegations of academic misconduct and fraud, but to better understand that fraud, I am going to have to explain just a couple basic statistical terms, because a man who spent 20 years teaching it is seemingly clueless towards them. At worst, this is a review of things that you learned in high school or maybe college statistics, and at best, hey, maybe we'll learn something new. Anyway, so as I explained, the mean is connected to the standard deviation, such that the mean is the average and the standard deviation is the spread from the mean. When you have multiple data sets and multiple means, you can plot those means, those averages, on their own line, and the spread between those means, much like standard deviation is the spread between data points on either side of a single mean, is the mean of means. That's the standard error. The word mean has surely lost all meaning by this point.
What do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean?
We would expect some variation in the standard errors across multiple models, but there is none in several of these papers that Stewart authored or co-authored. They were absolutely identical to the third decimal place, looking a bit like someone copy and pasted some data sets. Relatedly, almost none of the outputs resulted in a 0 in the third decimal place, which is unusual because these numbers are rounded up from the fourth decimal place, meaning anything under a 0.004, for example, should be reported as 0.00, and yet there are almost no zeros to be found in the third decimal place. Again, I know this sounds a bit nerdy, but when you look at data all the time, strange idiosyncrasies like that start to stick out. Why are the standard errors identical? That's not normal. Why are there almost no zeros in the third decimal place? That's not normal. And when you're familiar with looking at this kind of thing, it just looks wrong prima facie, at face value. Is this statistically possible? Yes. But it's extremely odd. The issue of atypical standard error stability was present in 4 of the 5 studies that Smith looked at. Smith also found an irregularity in the distribution of p-values across the 5 studies. A p-value, or alpha level, is a test of statistical significance, which gives us a good idea of whether or not the results are due to random error. The standard for significance in the social sciences is set at p being less than 0.05, meaning that we would predict, were we to reconduct the same analysis 100 times over, we would only see different results 5 times out of that 100. P-values should be uniformly distributed, but in these 5 studies, they are anything but. And if you want to uniformly distribute your p-value, go in the sink. Just make sure you move the dishes out of the way first. 50% of the p-values fell between 0.00 and 0.044. Hey, statistical significance, sure, but that is not a uniform distribution, not even close.
But, it's like I say, not even close, baby.
More tellingly, not a single p-value fell between the 0.045 and 0.105 range across the 791 values in the 5 studies. Once again, statistically, this is possible, but it's also extremely bizarre. It's interesting how there were absolutely no p-values that fell just outside of statistical significance. Curious that. There was also an impossible discrepancy between the p-values and the coefficients in Stewart et al.'s 2018 piece. Similarly odd is that across 2 studies, Johnson 2011 and Stewart 2015, with 2 completely different samples of participants, with Johnson drawing from subjects of different races and Stewart drawing only from a sample of Hispanic subjects, the means and standard deviations are identical for every single demographic variable. The means and SDs are also identical for perceived Hispanic criminal, economic, and political threat, homicide rate, percent Republican, and population structure. Once again, is this statistically possible? Technically, but the odds are beyond astronomical that 2 completely separate samples, one only of Hispanic people and the other one of people from multiple different racial backgrounds, would be 1-to-1 identical to one another. These 2 studies are drawn from the same dataset, yes, so it seems that in this case the identical nature is the result of haphazardly copying and pasting them from a previous study without bothering to properly calculate the means and standard deviations for the Hispanic-only sample. But that wasn't the only strange thing about the Johnson 2011 and Stewart 2015 pieces, as again, despite being drawn from the same sample, collected by the research network, allegedly, the sample size somehow grew from 1,184 in 2011 to 1,379 in 2015. Which one's accurate? Were data excluded from the 2011 study only to be included in the 2015 one? It's impossible to tell without the raw data, but certainly suspicious that the exact same set of data seems to have reproduced a little bit, particularly considering that the response rate, 54.8%, mean age 47.12, and mean household income, 62,700, remained identical. If data were excluded from the 2011 paper, then these variables should not remain unchanged. As I keep saying, statistically it's possible, but it's unbelievably improbable. Were these data to be accurate, they would indicate complete parity between white and Hispanic populations, meaning, if accurate, that there is absolutely no racial disparity between these 2 groups, while Dr. Stewart is arguing for differences between racial groups. He catch-22'd himself. The simple math errors continue across these 2 particular studies, as Stewart 2015 reported that in his sample 25% of families earned less than $50,000 a year, around 14% earned between $50,000 and $75,000, 9% earned between $75,000 and $100,000, and about 12% earned more than $100,000. You don't have to be a statistician to figure out real quickly that 25 plus 14 plus 9 plus 12 doesn't add up to 100, it adds up to 60. So where's the other 40%? Who knows? Stewart also reports the median income of this sample as $40,900, which is also impossible if only 25% of participants earned less than $50,000 a year, as the median is the middle point of a data set. By definition, the median cannot be less than $50,000. This figure also seems to have been copied from Johnson 2011, as using the same dataset despite all of the discrepancies elsewhere, they also report the median income as $40,900, but they report 52.4% of their sample as earning under $50,000 a year, which at least makes that median mathematically possible, unlike Stewart's 2015 report. In order for that to be the true median, however, then only 2.4% of the sample would have family incomes falling between $40,900 and $50,000. In 2010, the median US household income was just over $50,000, and in Florida the median was $44,409. So again, this is possible, at least in the 2011 report, if not in the 2015 one, but also highly unlikely. That comprises the bulk of John Smith's contentions with the 5 articles, and again, these issues were raised to FSU and Stewart's co-authors back in May of 2018, and yet after 3 years, as of 2021, Florida State's Third Inquiry Committee determined that while yes, there were consistent errors with standard deviation mean discrepancies across 10 different publications, even after the retraction of 6 papers, they still chalked it all up to mistakes rather than misconduct. So let's get back to our timeline and find out what happened in this investigation following FSU and Georgia State excusing all of Dr. Stewart's faulty data as just little oopsies, and FSU even aiding him in retaining legal counsel to potentially take action against those blowing the whistle, using taxpayer money, as FSU is a public university, to do so that we can see just where this story ultimately ends. As previously mentioned, and perhaps as part of a joke probably funny only to him, on April Fool's Day of 2021, Dr. Stewart sent a complete chronology of his research method justifications in a document to Gary Ostrander to outline the accuracy of the 5 retracted articles. Yeah, the articles have already been removed from the record, including by his own request, but Stewart is still trying to tell FSU that actually, he did nothing wrong. More retractions than Genghis Khan's foreskin, and he's still claiming innocence. Who the hell writes these jokes?
Not Smegma Man, Smegma Man.
Smegma Man.
No!
He also specifically mentions the research network's involvement, but recall that the research network was not listed as the source for the phone survey data in any of the studies that used phone survey data, 4 out of the 5, later 6 retracted pieces. His proof that these datasets came from the research network, which he now appears to be claiming definitively as the source, is an email from Mark Gates saying that he sent datasets to Stewart in 2008, 2009, 2013, 2017, and 2018. Of course, Stewart does not have access to these datasets because of his hard drive failure, in which case you would think that Gates would have access, but for some unspecified reason, I guess he never bothered to ask Gates to send him another copy. One has never been provided. By this point, Stewart was surely aware that one of the criticisms of his use of the research network to conduct his phone survey research, that he claims across 3 of his retracted papers was collected in 2013, is that the research network had closed by that point. Thus, in his defense, he claims that this was a mistake, and that he meant to report that the data were collected between 2008 and 2010, conveniently their last year of operation. Strange to make that error 3 separate times, but that kind of thing is just par for the course with Dr. Stewart, it seems. Relatedly, he claims that the discrepancies between the means and standard deviations is because he calculated them as ordinal variables rather than binary variables on accident. I'm sorry, you did what now? Binary variables are one or the other between 2 options. Ordinal variables lie between 2 points, but the distance between the points is not necessarily uniform. This is the kind of thing that most people learn in high school or undergraduate level math, not something that should be of issue and confusion for a scholar with 20 years of publication and history of teaching research methods. Dr. Stewart, you should be able to see with a glance that these calculations are wrong. After all, that's how everyone else ended up thinking something about your data were suspect. Of course, rather than take responsibility for such a monumentally stupid misstep, he claims that, well, standard deviations just don't matter. Okay, sure, maybe you could make an argument for that, Dr. Stewart, and he would not be alone. A number of scholars have advocated for removing the standard procedure of including SDs in publications as they don't really add much additional information. However, the problem is in the discrepancy. If the SD does not align with the mean, then it's equally likely that the mean is wrong. They are connected mathematically, and means definitely matter. If you have made it this far into this video, then I would wager that you, dear viewer, probably understand far more about why, if the standard deviation and mean don't match, then one of them is wrong, than 20-year professor Dr. Stewart seemingly does. When called out, he basically just said that standard deviations are stupid and don't matter.
I don't care.
We have industrial shredders.
I don't care. Being president's hard.
Okay, have your nap.
Okay. Can you lay out my little play mat?
While Stewart does admit to the errors, he continues to insist that they're inconsequential to the overall findings, and seems to imply that he was being magnanimous in requesting their retraction when he didn't really need to. Legitimately Lord Farquaad behavior.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
He is adamant that there was no falsification nor fabrication of data, and describes his fellow scholars, presumably Dr. Pickett primarily, but also Heathers and Brown, public questioning of his work as unconscionable. He further states that their criticism has created a, quote, highly toxic environment where there was an inherent willingness and urgency to discredit my record, end quote. The rest of the letter covering the individual studies is largely redacted beyond the purpose of each study and the hypothesis questions, including, presumably, any information regarding the source of the data, which Stewart, by this point, is now explicitly claiming to be the research network, and that the data absolutely exist. He just messed up thrice over by stating that they were collected in 2013. But again, I have no way of knowing what's in the rest of this letter, as it is redacted. After a year of mostly silence, both public and private, on April 11th of 2022, Dean Blomberg and FSU's Associate Director of Faculty Relations, Rebecca Peterson, conducted an interview with Dr. Stewart. In response to a question asking him about his familiarity with FSU's data retention policies, Stewart stated that he maintains data for 3 years, and then purges them while maintaining records of the data. That's not exactly standard practice, as scholars are required to maintain data for 7 years, something later in this interview Stewart admits he is aware of, yet here he insists that 3 is the norm. He also claims that he had stringent methods of data protection and storage, and did not store anything to the cloud. Well, Dr. Stewart, I wouldn't consider having data that presumably would have cost you tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands, not backed up besides on a single laptop hard drive anywhere, to be very secure, let alone evidence of your ability to protect and secure data. In response to a question about when his data began to come under scrutiny, he says he thinks it was in 2019, it was in 2018, but who's counting? And even more incorrectly, he claims that the issues were solely concerning only problems with his reported standard deviations. At this point, you and I both know that was not the main issue, merely one amongst many. It's the academic equivalent of saying the legal issue with your bank robbery was that you parked your getaway car in the handicapped spot. Although, if this really is the extent and robustness of your defense, maybe you deserve such a spot. He also says there were issues with the decimal places and that he doesn't even understand the criticism. Dr. Stewart, let me explain to you. The problem was that your standard errors were identical to the third decimal place, a ridiculous improbability, not that you didn't report to the third decimal place. He also states his critics, quote, counted all the zeros and there weren't enough. No, it was the lack of zeros almost entirely that immediately popped out as bizarre, given your rounding to the third decimal, in which case we would expect some zeros. There are plenty of things that irritate me, but pretending to be stupid is probably the one that irks me the most, and in my opinion, Dr. Stewart is pretending to be stupid here, and seemingly just hoping that those interviewing him buy into it. You are a full professor of criminology, Dr. Stewart. I don't think the idiot defense works here. When asked if there were claims of falsification of data, Dr. Stewart responded in the affirmative, and that it was based on the notion that he had too many samples from the South. That was not the contention. It was that he listed more students at more urban schools in the South than actually exist. He says that the complaints were also about Stewart not providing the data for free for others to use in their own analysis, implying that the real motive for those criticizing him is that they were trying to steal his data, the data that he doesn't have, yet he is seemingly claiming here that Dr. Pickett is trying to steal from him. He also claimed in response to a question about the number of investigations into his conduct that people were blowing things out of proportion based on inaccurate information. That's a bit difficult to believe, Dr. Stewart. When your primary critic was your former student who reconstructed your data and requested retraction of a paper that he himself was a co-author on. Speaking of which, Stewart was then asked why he and his co-authors requested that their papers be retracted, and he responded that he had made corrections to 2 papers, corrections which were subsequently rejected, and that the real problem was social media posts, which made it difficult for him to finish his corrections. This is a boogie tier defense, Dr. Stewart.
I could show you the IPs where I got hacked.
I could show you everything. I can show you everything, and you'll never believe me because you don't give a.
Hold it! You're not wrong, Walter. You're just an asshole.
He notes that a major issue was that historical counties in his lynching data no longer existed, and that's why his lynching studies looked wonky due to data merging, as well as the fact that he accidentally coded Kansas and Missouri as southern states. Maybe he needs a crash course on geography.
AIDS, the one where they all touch kids. The one that has a really funny name, and the one that can suck my dick.
He continued to insist that his findings were sound and accurate, but that these little, insignificant issues had turned into a social media firestorm, forcing his hand and that of his co-authors into retracting the papers. Stewart states that he shared data outputs and results with his co-authors during the projects, but never specifies that he ever shared raw data with them. He insists again that the coding errors were largely related to clustering of counties that historically existed yet do not in modernity, ignoring all other data errors. While he says he handed his data over to the college for review, he admits that he lost all of the raw data in the hard drive crash in 2019 during the height of the concerns.
You can't have both.
Goodbye. Goodbye, rationality.
Regarding the 2003 paper that he did not personally request be retracted, he again explains that he no longer has access to his data, even though he was using public data to conduct his analysis, which is why Dr. Pickett was able to recreate it, and that he used methods that were acceptable at the time, but are no longer standard practice. I have no idea what methods were standard in 2003 in criminology, and that would produce erroneous results, nor seemingly does Dr. Pickett, but his excuse regarding the 2003 paper is apparently just that statistics were different 20 years ago. They absolutely were not.
Y'all built different. I'm built incorrectly. I'm just raw in every way.
Regarding the 10 papers that were investigated in 2021 by FSU concerning standard deviation mean discrepancies, Stewart again downplays the problem and reiterates that the errors don't really affect his overall findings, even though they do call the means into question inherent. He notes that the papers are still active and that he was unable to provide any data for further review due to the hard drive crash, which he also claims counts as the data being backed up. Yes, he claimed that the data being stored in one place, on his laptop, counts as it being backed up. That is some Patrick Star level logic, sir.
Aren't you Eric Stewart? And this is your data set?
Yep.
I found this data set on this hard drive.
Yep.
And if that's the case, this must be your data set. Then recognize it.
No, it's a backup.
Oh, you gimbaled!
He says he has no idea why the National Science Foundation was investigating his work, insists that the errors are all due to him learning a different method of statistics which has been phased out over time. Legitimately, different kind of learner excuse, I guess.
But no, I get it. You're a different kind of intellect and you're a different kind of learner, right?
And ends the interview by stating that while he made errors, those errors were not the result of misconduct, completing his statement by mentioning how he and his family had been negatively affected by the investigations into his work. Well, Dr. Stewart, while I don't doubt that, the field of criminology has been negatively affected by your work, too. After another year of silence, on March 10th of 2023, Florida State issued a letter of intention to terminate Dr. Stewart's employment at the university, to which he was invited to submit a written rebuttal to a panel of peers for review in an attempt to save his position. Dr. Stewart's response to the panel described the decision to terminate him after 4 or 5 years of investigation at that point as, quote, arbitrary and capricious, implying that all criticisms against him were just racist. In his response, he went on to claim that Dean Blomberg explicitly requested that he retract his papers in the presence of Dr. Warren Hightower, who would corroborate this claim, which is a bit of a bold accusation to make in response to Dr. Blomberg himself, who would know whether or not he had instructed Dr. Stewart to do so. According to Blomberg, he did not, and instead, Stewart and his colleagues requested the retraction of all of their own papers, with the exception of the 2003 publication, and provided evidence of this with email communications between Stewart and the editors of Criminology, in which Stewart specifically states that the request for retraction was voluntary. Dean Blomberg further explicates how Stewart continued to insist that there were no errors in his data, even while he was requesting retraction, again voluntarily. In his response, Stewart also mentions the positive evaluations that he had received over the course of the investigation process regarding his performance as a professor, and he did indeed receive positive evaluations from both colleagues and from students, although this fell over time from exceeding expectations in 2020 to meeting expectations in 2021. Dr. Stewart also stated that FSU had 3 times over cleared him of all claims of misconduct, but Dean Blomberg disagreed with this assessment, instead stating that the university consistently lacked enough evidence to definitively charge Stewart with misconduct, not that they found he had made no errors. I somewhat disagree from my reading of the inquiry reports and can, for once, understand where Dr. Stewart was coming from with that interpretation. At every point, for 4 years, FSU ignored or dismissed serious issues with his work as being due to any explanation besides misconduct. It does seem to me, however, that Dr. Stewart's response to the intention to terminate letter was the final straw that broke Dean Blomberg's back, where he could no longer tolerate the gaslighting and manipulation coming from Dr. Stewart as it pertained to his own prior actions and statements. For example, another issue that Dean Blomberg took umbrage with is that in his response, Dr. Stewart claimed that FSU had abruptly removed him from his teaching duties in March, which, while true, implied that he had been fired, when instead he was placed on paid administrative leave, with his role as instructor being taken over by other professors, which itself actually only revealed more information about the quality of Dr. Stewart's work as an instructor outside of his work as a researcher. One of the instructors who took over teaching Stewart's online courses found that his, quote, class instruction appeared to be minimal at best and meaningless at worst, as he taught directly out of the textbook with no additional lesson plans besides the stock ones prepared by the textbook manufacturer. Everything Dr. Stewart taught, earning nearly $200,000 a year to do so, a student could learn from a secondhand textbook, purchased for $10. Stewart didn't even respond to student emails, but instead forwarded all of them to his teaching assistants. In one of the classes Stewart taught offline, Introduction to Research Methods, oh the irony, students reported that they rarely attended the class because they perceived it as having no tangible benefit. Stewart frequently canceled class or held online sessions in which he would read, again directly from the textbook. Similarly, his quizzes and tests were also derived directly from published texts. Why should students pay $5,000 to $10,000 a year, the in-state and out-of-state tuition fees for Florida State, to have a textbook, which they also had to pay for, occasionally read at them? Dean Blomberg also notes the absurdity of a professor who himself requested the retraction of 5 of his own papers due to their errors exceeding the threshold for published research be allowed to teach research methods. The news of FSU's letter of intent to terminate was quickly circulated amongst Dr. Stewart's friends and colleagues, many of whom sent letters of their own to the university in advocacy. For example, Dr. Ronald L. Simmons, professor of sociology at Georgia State, sent a lengthy letter to Dr. James Clark, speaking glowingly of Dr. Stewart, calling him a rock star of criminology. Dr. Simmons uses the term data thugs, describes the errors as small mistakes and inconsequential, mentions an accidental hard drive malfunction, dismisses the claims of the whistleblower, and states that Dr. Stewart retracted his articles at the request of Dean Blomberg. Yeah, it's pretty clear that Dr. Simmons only heard one side of this story, as those are all of the hallmarks of Dr. Stewart's particular perspective on things, from the contested claims that Blomberg had demanded the retraction all the way down to his use of the specific terminology data thug. He also somewhat threateningly states that the dismissal of Dr. Stewart will harm FSU's ability to recruit top faculty and graduate students, particularly persons of color, and that it is Stewart's dismissal, not his own actions, which stain the reputation and integrity of the university. Simmons goes on to complain that FSU should have given Stewart at least a year of notice of termination to allow him to seek employment at another institution, while I personally think he shouldn't be working anywhere, at least not in academia, and described the letter as, quote, blaming the victim. Simmons ends his letter with an accusation of the termination as being politically motivated due to Stewart being a black man who studies race in DeSantis' Florida. Now, I'm sure some of you may have been a bit shocked to hear another professor falling all over himself to defend, nay, simp for Dr. Stewart given everything that we know. See? But remember, that's what we, who have actually investigated this case, know. Given the specific language used by Dr. Simmons, it seems fairly obvious to me that he has been fed Dr. Stewart's take on the situation, in which he is an innocent, acclaimed researcher who just made a couple of little mistakes in his reporting of his standard deviations, and doesn't have the data from a 2003 study, and he was being attacked by racist data thugs in the ultra-conservative, backward state of Florida, at a university so racist that they paid for his legal counsel to try and shut down anyone speaking against him, and that Simmons took Stewart at his word, spurring him to write this incensed letter of complaint. Dr. Simmons was not alone either, as Dr. Balmer of Penn State's Sociology and Criminology Department, and co-author of the retracted 2015 paper, wrote a similar letter which praises Stewart and gives a few specifics regarding the actual reasons for the termination, and states that he would no longer recommend colleagues work at FSU or suggest it to students as a graduate program. Dr. Brian Johnson, the Associate Chair of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland College Park, and co-author of the retracted 2011 paper, also sent a letter to FSU claiming that Stewart only retracted his papers due to public pressure and repeated that FSU's 3 investigations uncovered no misconduct. He also mentions Dr. Stewart's race and states that the decision to terminate him was made for political expediency. Dr. Toya Like of the University of Missouri-Kansas City, in her own letter, said she was certain that Dr. Stewart was being targeted because of his race and spoke to his quality as a researcher, despite admitting to never having personally worked with him on a research project. Dr. Richard Rosenfield, Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of Missouri-St. Louis, described the termination as outrageous, inexcusable, and based on faulty accusations. Dr. Robert Crutchfield, Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington, admits that Stewart's papers had errors, and that his view of Stewart is skewed due to knowing him for many years, but still argued that the whole affair was the result of a handful of criminologists determined to, quote, take him down, and instead requested that FSU stand up for scholars such as Stewart who advance racial justice. Dr. Janet Luritson, Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of Missouri-St. Louis, said in her letter that she had known Dr. Stewart since 2004 and that her knowledge of the reasons for his termination were limited to FSU's intent to terminate letter, and related her own personal issues with hard drive failures. She also stated that errors and corrections are common, praised Stewart for retracting his faulty work, and concluded that Stewart's termination would be harmful to the reputation of FSU, not at all another veiled threat. Dr. Warren Hightower of FSU, who co-authored 4 papers with Dr. Stewart, none of which were amongst the retracted, wrote by far the longest letter of complaint, coming in at 4 full pages, and in said lengthy complaint goes further than some of her colleagues, stating that she was in the room when Dean Blomberg ordered Dr. Stewart to retract his papers, and given that she works in Dean Blomberg's department, is thereby seemingly something that she's willing to stake not just her own career on, but also that of Dean Blomberg. Perhaps more specifically, she's willing to stake her career against that of her direct superior. She reiterated that none of the 3 FSU inquiry committees nor the Georgia State Inquiry Committee found evidence of intentional misconduct, and strangely, uses the term arbitrary and capricious to describe Dr. Stewart's termination. Odd. That is the exact phrase that Dr. Stewart himself used to describe it. She goes on to list off a series of errors made by other scholars in the field of criminology, as if that somehow absolves Dr. Stewart, another thing that he himself was wont to do in his defense, and says that her heart bleeds for him. When I see these scholars all not just repeating the same narratives that Dr. Stewart has constructed to defend himself, but even repeating the exact same phraseology, data thugs and arbitrary and capricious, I just can't help but think that they're doing little more than acting as mouthpieces for him, or perhaps vice versa. Plenty of these letters seem to come from scholars in the same field who are completely unfamiliar with the situation and are merely lending their support for a colleague, but several, specifically those from Warren Hightower, Balmer, and Simmons, read as if they could have been written by Stewart himself, or at least that they share the same author. Ultimately, no amount of letters of support could stop the inevitable, particularly, I would imagine, after Dr. Stewart's response to the panel, in which he accused Dean Blomberg of forcing him to retract his papers, continued to insist that there were no significant errors, misrepresented his performance reviews and the findings of the inquiry committees, and the subsequent reveal that Stewart frequently cancels classes, works remotely, and taught directly out of a textbook, using entirely materials provided by the publisher for tests, quizzes, and assignments, and thus, on July 13th, 2023, Provost Clark sent a final letter of termination to Dr. Stewart, ending his troubled tenure at Florida State due to demonstrable incompetence. Dr. Clark states in his letter that, according to the FSU Faculty Handbook, incompetence is defined as, quote, failure to perform instructional responsibilities, including repeated unauthorized class absences, lack of interaction with students in an online course, failure to provide appropriate feedback to students, and failure to perform assigned research activities. He notes that in the 4 years that the university was investigating this case, not once did Dr. Stewart even attempt to recreate his own research, which Dr. Pickett did. Nor did he even bother to work with his co-authors to attempt to resolve the issues in the research, despite several members of the faculty at FSU offering to assist in recreation and remediation. Dr. Clark ends his letter by stating, quote, "I do not see how you can teach our students to be ethical researchers or how the results of future research projects conducted by you could be deemed as trustworthy," and therefore proceeded with the termination of Dr. Eric Stewart. As of the writing of this video, he has not found placement at another university, and with that, just as Dr. Stewart reached the end of his tenure at FSU, we also reached the end of our investigation, but stay with me for just a few moments longer as we wrap everything up that we've learned today here by looking at just what are the implications for this entire debacle, not just in criminology, but across all of academia. Dr. Eric Stewart was not just some random professor. He was a well-respected, well-published rock star of criminology, as Dr. Simmons described him. As of his 2016 CV, which is the one that's available online that he strangely has never bothered to update, and thus these data are not entirely accurate to 2023, but still telling, Dr. Stewart co-authored or authored 52 published pieces of research. He refereed 4 book chapters and presented 32 papers at conference. Again, we know it's far more than that by now. Google Scholar reveals that his work has been cited 8,543 times. 70 of his papers were cited more than 10 times, and his H-index score indicates that 43 of his papers have been cited more than 43 times. His most cited paper, a 2006 piece on recidivism, has been cited 713 times. His second most cited paper is his 2003 retracted article on school social bonds, with 533 citations. Compare that information with that of Dr. William Wilson, one of the most respected scholars of criminology, who also focuses on urban poverty and race. Dr. Wilson is one of only 25 full university professors at Harvard, has received 46 honorary degrees, has served as the president of the American Sociological Association, and is the recipient of the W.E.B. Du Bois Career of Distinguished Scholarship Award, the highest award the association offers. While Dr. Wilson has far more citations than Dr. Stewart, over 60,000, he's also worked in the field for far longer, completing his PhD in 1966, while Stewart completed his in 2000. Dr. Wilson has 56 papers cited over 56 times, and 137 papers cited over 10 times. Dr. Stewart was well on his way to being a renowned scholar on the level of someone like Dr. Wilson. Stewart received 3 academic awards of excellence from his doctoral alma mater, Iowa State, and their Dissertation Research Excellence Award. He also won a Distinguished Alumni Award from Fort Valley State, the Cormai Ritchie Mann Research Award from the American Society of Criminology's Division of People of Color and Crime, and the McNamara Research Award from the Academy of Criminal Justice and Sciences. He has served in fellowships in the National Consortium on Violence Research, the National Institute of Criminal Justice Sciences, the American Society of Criminology, the American Sociological Association, the Association of Black Sociologists, and has served as a member on the doctoral committees of 24 students who presumably have gone on to serve as scholars in the field of criminology, including Dr. Justin Pickett. Across all of his retracted papers, those 6 studies were collectively cited in other literature 609 times. And although the H-index for these papers is only 4, Dr. Stewart's work clearly had a significant impact on the field of criminology, as all of those letters from colleagues clearly illustrated. And just what was the impact that Stewart had? Well, his retracted research was largely concerned with the idea that historical lynchings cause white people today to view black people as criminal threats, and that similarly, the growth of Hispanic populations in an area also causes whites to perceive them as criminal threats. Dr. Stewart was a champion of the idea that disparities in crime and arrest rates were influenced by systemic racism, and outside of direct academic citation, Who knows how many times his work has been used to justify and evidence the existence of it? Inside academe, how many people's careers, papers, and work is built on his foundation of lies? Who can even say how many times one of these papers has been brought up in some lecture or speech or internet fight as proof positive of systemic racism, and were just taken as truth because they were published academic papers in impressive criminology journals, to say nothing of the students whose entire degrees and knowledge are now called into question? Beyond the harm that Dr. Stewart has caused to Florida State and the entire field of criminology, he has also caused untold harm to the fabric of America by lying to Americans in his claims that white people just inherently see black and brown people as criminals and thus want to punish them unjustly. I cannot say with absolute certainty that Stewart fabricated or outright did lie, although regarding that phone surveying, I fail to see how he could possibly have obtained those data that would have cost tens of thousands to collect, and no one, after 5 years of searching, seems to be able to produce them. But the amount of error at seemingly every level of what we can see is so severe as to go far beyond mere sloppiness. And his excuses about not knowing that the mean and standard deviation are mathematically linked variables either means he's trying to cover something up, or that he is far too inept to be publishing scientific papers in the first place. Either way, the people at the highest levels of his field lined up to defend him for 4 going on 5 years. I know that I'm in a very specialized place, but I honestly felt like I was talking down to you, dear viewer, when I was explaining things like means and standard deviations and standard errors and why they're linked, though I was not trying to do so, nor do I think that I was. But I felt that way because, well, that was the kind of review material that we covered in about an hour in my master's program. This man, Dr. Stewart, not only holds a doctorate, but he teaches research methods. My brother in Christ, how can you teach research methods and then say that you don't understand why it's a problem when your means and standard deviations are unaligned? The errors are not only in the published data, but in Stewart's complete inability to at any point provide FSU with any of his data, only at best partial recreations, which was so egregious that the fact that they reviewed these issues 3 times over, and while they consistently found errors, felt no need to take action for 5 years, and even then, seemingly only definitively decided to do so after the professors who took over his teaching duties realized that he was working out of the textbook verbatim. That would never fly under normal circumstances, and it's obvious from the beginning that Dr. Stewart used his race and his research focus on race to dismiss all criticisms as nothing more than racism. And all along the way, there were people around him supporting him, surely because they saw it as advantageous to their own careers and political goals. Regardless, it's time for some other university to prove how totally not racist that they are and hire this rock star of criminology. We will have to see who's going to step up to the plate, perhaps one of the universities from which the scholars sent Stewart so many letters of support, but I think he'd fit in just fine at the Evergreen State Daycare. I do want to say that in late 2021, I'm not sure exactly when, Dr. Stewart's father passed away, surely making all of this scrutiny that he was under all the more intense and emotionally difficult, and I can sympathize with him over the loss of his father. I can't empathize, but I can sympathize. However, I cannot sympathize with what I can only describe as a flagrant disrespect and disregard of the scientific method, academic honesty, and data transparency. Dr. Stewart, others have described your firing as a stain on FSU and the field of criminology, but no, I disagree. You are the stain on the field of criminology, sociology, and social science more broadly, and I would not trust a single published paper in your CV to be totally accurate, if not outright fraudulent, including your own doctoral dissertation. I think they should all be reviewed, and I hope that the data thugs like John Smith never stop questioning your work, as they should all scholars, particularly those whose work could have such major effects on public policy and politics such as yours. Errors in academia are common, yes, that's why we have a replication crisis, that's why we have corrigenda, that's why we have retractions. But what I have seen, what everyone who has looked for more than a few minutes has seen in your work is not little mistakes. They are irreconcilable errors, incalculable sloppiness, and just gaping voids of raw data. In my personal opinion, were Dr. Stewart a white professor, he would have been, and should have been, fired after the initial inquiry, which found all of those errors but chalked them all up to little minor missteps not even worth correcting. But because he's a black man, and because he constantly made his race part of the discussion, FSU was terrified of terminating him out of fear of public backlash. So, has there been backlash outside of those pleading letters from other faculty? Well, I figured the best place to go to find out was the brain trust of academic integrity itself, Reddit. They love a good race grift, so what did they think about the firing of the Jussie Smollett of academia? Well, it's about what you would expect. Quote, "I'm glad that bogus science was uncovered and corrected. Unfortunately, this will give the bigots more ammunition to work on the bigot-adjacent folks who can be convinced to support more bigoted laws," says Zhivago6, who totally really cares about actual science, while Round Dog Eye asks, quote, "Is there a better source for this? I can't find anything outside of the right-wing sphere when I try to look into this more, unintentionally noticing that no left-wing media seems to want to touch this topic. Strange that. Wonder why." TSD guy, hey friend, you spelled TDS wrong, rather ironically assumes that being fired for bad data must make Dr. Stewart a conservative, quipping, quote, "I'm sure some more accommodating university will pick him up. Is Bob Jones hiring? Or he can always work for PragerU, which is now an authorized Florida educational content provider." So yeah, what you expect from the brain trust. As I mentioned though, really there has been little backlash because the left-wing media outlets don't want to touch this one, because no amount of spin can paint Dr. Stewart as the victim of anything beyond his own actions here, and any digging into it would only reveal the support structure that propped him up for years. Whether they be the result of pure incompetence or intentional misconduct, his attempts to make himself the Jussie Smollett of academia, going so far as to claim the university was lynching him, seems to have failed. The left doesn't seem to care. They haven't risen to riot in his defense. They're simply ignoring this one. But I'm not, as the length and extent of this video should illustrate. And so with all of that in mind, let's come to a few conclusions. There is an ideal of academia. The pristine ivory tower, the shining city on the hill where there is no possibility for lies nor deception, all is laid open and bare for scrutiny, for the purpose of advancing science and the world along with it. It is pure, it is transparent, it is truth. It is not. If academia ever was such a thing, it has become corrupted. It took 4 inquiries, 5 years, and 6 retractions before anyone seemed to seriously respond to what was obvious academic misconduct because, in my opinion, the scholar was a black man studying racism in America who had a career of nothing but acclaim. Had John Smith, whoever he is, Pickett, Heathers, Brown, and others not been adamant in their search for truth in the crumbling tower of academe, he likely would have continued his pattern of behavior indefinitely, perhaps even achieving a position of status as high as that of someone like Dr. William Wilson, going down in the annals of academic history as a crowning figure in criminology. Thankfully, he has been debunked, disgraced, and disrobed from his position of power, and I can only pray no other university sees fit to ferry such a fraud to further accolade. But hey, what do you guys think? Do you think that Dr. Stewart really did fake his data? Or was he just inept and sloppy? Why not both? Was Dr. Pickett too aggressive in his pursuit of Dr. Stewart, or was he right to keep the pressure up on him and Florida State? Do you think Florida State helped to cover up the allegations, or did they engage in rigorous review? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. While you're down there, if you liked the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you're not already subscribed, as well as check out a link to my sponsor in the description and the pinned comment. If you would like to support my work, you can find links in the description to my Patreon and Subscribestar, so that you can see your name at the end of every video along with these lads and ladies here. You'll also get access to my Discord, where I preview these videos before they go live. And just join our little social science community. You can also check out my geeky social science merch on my merch store, including brand new products related to this very video. Want to identify yourself as a data thug? I mean, who doesn't? Well, worry not, because I've got you covered, data thugs. Additionally, I've got some fresh Ace Attorney, or in this instance, Ace Academic inspired merch based on the case of Dr. Eric Stewart, which turned into quite a turnabout indeed. So if you're interested in getting some of this geeky gear, then click the link to my merch store down below in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.